Hi, Geoff Huston. I'm with APNIC, and this is some work I've done with George Michelson on measuring IPv6. And I just want to give you an update on what we see and why we see it, and perhaps introduce a little bit of economics into the debate about the underlying issues that are going on here at the moment. This is the count that we see looking at V6 across the last couple of years. It's not quite the same as Google's. And part of it is we've tried exceptionally hard to re-weight these numbers to actually account for the fact that the world is not Google coloured, oddly enough. Now, it'll come as a surprise to some of you. There are a lot of users in China. There are a lot of users in India. And their intensity of use of Google differs from, say, you here, or folk in America, or folk in other economies. So when you just take a raw count of folk who go to Google's web pages, or as we get, a feed of data coming from where Google have placed online advertisements, you're not seeing a uniform sample of the world. You're seeing a sample of the world of folk who use Google a lot, and it sort of misses folk who don't. And so what we've done in this graph here is actually re-weighted the numbers we get based on the best estimate we have of users per country. Now, you and I both know that the stats coming from the ITU are pretty crap, but no one else publishes any data whatsoever, and it's kind of the best we have out there. And so what we do is weight these sample numbers against the population-corrected ITU numbers, because the world keeps on having more people in it, and then pushing it back out this way. And so there are a few sort of issues about this. There's slightly more usage on the weekend than weekdays. It's something about corporate firewalls or whatever, I don't really know. And there's a very small number of folk who are V6 capable. So if you give them something that's only in V6, they will get it, but when you give them the choice, they will not necessarily use V6. And if you've looked hard at the way your Mac works, if you're running Mac OS, that's probably you. Because Mac OS doesn't have a strong preference for 6, it actually uses a rather complicated algorithm that takes an estimate of what the round trip time is likely to be to somewhere it's never gone to, and makes a decision based on protocol. I think I just said random, didn't I? I did. It makes a random choice as to which protocol to use and just uses it anyway. Yeah, so that's why there's that ever so slight difference. Last year was kind of a good year, if good is, you know, a rise of 1.8%. This year hasn't been a good year, because it's been a rise of a lot less than that. If it doubles every year, 1.8%, 3.6%, you know, by 2019 we'll be there. Don't get too worked up, because it's only doing 2% a year, and if that continues, we will all be dead, apart from you very young folk out there, because it's going to take until 2067. By then, your carrier grade NATs will be nuclear powered, because you're just not going to survive any other way. Ain't going to work. World map, we've all seen world maps, that's another world map. This is a little more interesting, because the number of countries above the average is actually really quite low. And there are some interesting ones like Ecuador and Peru right up there. It's almost as if Telefonica is using Peru as a lab. So the number of countries that are, no one here's from Telefonica, are they? Yes, they are, sorry. The number of countries who are is actually really quite small. Some countries, Belgium, you know, an astonishing uptake. Germany too, 19%, that's really quite amazing. And we can drill down. We can drill down a fair way, and we're in the Netherlands, so this is the Netherlands. Something bad did happen over Christmas. Things got turned off a bit, don't know why. And then you turned it on again, gee, thanks. But there's no more rollout since December, not very good. So you're back to where you were. It's hardly exactly progress going on here. And there's the US, and it's certainly a more optimistic view, and that's largely influenced by Comcast. But there's something else going on too, because what we're able to do is sort of rank these providers by their number of customers. And there's no doubt in the United States, Comcast is by and large the biggest provider out there in access. AT&T, MCI, UUNet, these are all familiar names to all of us. So that's, the top 30 providers in the US. Who's doing V6? 7. Not 30, 7, just 7. This is kind of typical for most countries, that everyone isn't doing it, just a few folk are doing it. And then I started to think, well, what about the rest of the world? How typical is that? How many V6-enabled ISPs serve the world? That's an interesting question, because if around half of the Comcast users do V6, then maybe that's 20 million odd Americans. Ooh. AT&T, maybe that's 16 million. Deutsche Telekom, maybe that's 6.5 million folk using V6. And so this is kind of the V6 population ranking by provider. And certainly folk that you would expect to see there are there. KDDI, who's been doing stuff in Japan, 26% of their network is now running V6 with users. Proxat in Free, that's been doing it in France forever. And Telefónica del Peru, they're just up there, right up there with around 1/5 of their users doing V6. So this is not unusual. But let's add them up. And if I add them all up, 30 providers serve 94% of the V6 population. How many networks are out there? 50,000. So who's part of that 30? 1. Good. Oh, 2. 3. The rest of you are part of the 49,700 or so, or 9,030, who aren't. Because those do it, and literally everyone else isn't. Which is an interesting kind of observation, that this is a very small bunch of people doing a lot of work, and you're leaving it to them, because you're not doing anything that's visible. That's getting interesting. So, yep, 94% of the world's V6 users sit behind 30 access ISPs. Wow. Why? Why don't 100% of Comcast users run V6? Because they could. And why don't 100% of Verizon Mobile do V6? Because they could. Why is it only something like Google that manages an 87% penetration rate in their network? Because they gave out new CPE. They didn't go and buy it down at some local corner shop or Amazon or whatever and buy some crap made by, Netlink or Belkin 50 years ago and expect it to still work. CPE is a massive problem. Not only is it the bot army that basically drives most of the world's malice these days, it also is the bot army that stops most of you from doing their job. And it's so weird because it's only $50 a unit. And quite frankly, if you're in the ISP business, the temptation to just simply give everyone an open WRT box that actually has software that works should be overwhelming. So why aren't you doing it? Why do you do your best job and have users completely stuff you up by buying crap CPE? Why do movie makers make really, really excellent movies on phenomenal digital 7K stuff and you watch it on an iPhone? Same kind of problem. They do a great job and then you stuff it up. On the ISP business, you kind of get it to the front door and you let customers buy CPE and ruin all your work and all your investment. You're nuts. You are completely crazy. So, on to the next slide. What can I say? This is a slightly different view because now I want to look at, we know that there are 30 doing 94% of V6, but this is networking and this is a network defect. Your job is to connect your users with everyone else's users. You've got to do much the same thing together. Because if you go off running an all AppleTalk network, you're dead, right? You can't run a different protocol to everyone else. Outliers in this business die. So if you jump too soon or you jump too late, you die. You've got to run with the herd. And this business works by mob mentality. You do what everyone else does, literally. But that's not quite true. You do what the influencers do. You follow leads. So who provides influence in this business? Who drives everybody else? So this is my first modest attempt to try and figure out who drives this industry. So it's the 30 largest ISPs by user count. I told you China was big. 300 million people sitting behind ChinaNet backbone and another 207 million behind China 169. There are a lot of folk in that country, I've been told, and you know, that's the evidence. Also in India, which is number 3, BSNL, there are a lot of folk living there, and when they start rolling stuff out with $40 handsets that do internet, that's a lot of people, and that's what we're seeing. So the largest one in America, Comcast, comes in at number 4 by that ranking. So I bolded up in that top 30 the 5 who are doing 6. Comcast, AT&T, Deutsche Telekom, TMNet in Malaysia, and KDDI. And so you kind of think, well, maybe that's the folk who should be. Maybe they're driving this business because, you know, just 5. What a strange font. Oh, it's the mouse. Just 5 of those top 30 largest ISPs have any significant V6. Now, those 30 actually service 42% of the world's population down the bottom. This is a really skewed business. If we thought we were destroying the big telcos, we've rebuilt them again. But anyway, those 30 do 40%. But perhaps we're asking too much of BSNL. Perhaps we're asking too much of the developing world. So maybe we should look at value. How do you value an access business? One way, which seems pretty logical to me, is by the purchasing power of your customers. The more money they have, the more value they have, the more value they represent. So why don't we multiply your users by the GDP per capita of the country you're in? That might get interesting. And let's call that net user value. And this gets really quite interesting. If we multiply that out, we get to 30 providers do 43% of the value base of the entire internet, and just 6 of them have any V6 deployment. But if all those 30 did their job, the rest of you would have no choice, because they're the influencers, and that's the list. Comcast, if you multiply things out by GDP, are clearly on the top of that list. Their value, or the value of their users, is intensely large. ChinaNet still has a lot of people. And though the GDP per capita is lower, they still have a lot of people. But again, there's another American in the 3rd slot, AT&T, NTT in Japan in the 5th slot, Deutsche Telekom in the 6th. But again, you look at, there are so few there that are doing 6, and that is 43% of the value of the internet, the value of the users of the internet. And if you're looking at who we should be beating up on, NTL Virgin Media Limited, I think they're Unity these days or something, Orange in France for the old France Telecom, they're not doing anything, and maybe they should. Because if all these folk did it, the rest of you have no choice, literally no choice, because these are the folk that drive the business. This is the influences of the herd, because this is where the money lies. So the one thing that's kind of interesting about this is that those 30 largest providers account for 94% of the user population and 28% of the value who are doing V6. So V6 right now is actually bigger than we thought. There's a lot of value in V6 right now because some of those providers, particularly Comcast, represent quite a rich stream of value. And what you come out of that is, if I rank it this way, V6 currently accounts for not just a little over 3% of the world's users, but actually accounts for 7% of the network's value. Because what we have done is provision V6 to the rich. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing if we're trying to influence everybody, because it's those buying patterns that matter. So, what do we hum from this? I don't agree with Google. I think if you take the Chinese into account, it's about 4%, little under. The significant volumes in around 20 economies. But realistically, this is a very, very bulked up business. It's no longer the little entrepreneur driving it. 30 ISPs serve the bulk of the V6 population. A subtly different 30 actually service the bulk of the world. But those 30 who service the V6 population also service 28% of the world in terms of value, and that's 7% of the world's value. So if you're kind of looking at who you should be saying, why aren't you? Why aren't they doing it? You know, I would be looking at the folk on this list who aren't, and kind of wondering why. They're rich businesses and their business depends on having a future. They're the folk with the rich customers, and they're the folk who really should be up there with a much denser list than just the 6 or so I can see there. So that's the update for May. With luck and with hope, that list will be longer by October. If the economics is right, yes. But whether you guys behave as economic rationalists or not, I leave that up to you. Thank you.
Any questions or comments for Geoff? Come now. I dare say.
Thank you.
Very well. Next step. Sorry? Next step is, are we straight into the lightning talks? Yep. Thank you. In that case, do you want this?